Lesson 10, Spiritual Evolution. One of the things that repel many persons who have had their attention directed to the subject of metempsychosis for the first time, is the idea that they have evolved as a soul from individual lowly forms, for instance that they have at one time been an individual plant, and then an individual animal form, and then an individual higher animal form, and so on until now they are the particular individual human form contemplating the subject. This idea, which has been taught by many teachers, is repellent to the average mind, for obvious reasons, and naturally so, for it has no foundation in truth. While this lesson 1, principally concerned with the subject of the spiritual evolution of the human soul, since it became a human soul, still it may be as well to mention the previous phase of evolution, briefly, in order to prevent misconception, and to dispel previously acquired error. The atom, although it possesses life and a certain degree of mind, and acts as an individual temporarily, has no permanent individuality that reincarnates. When the atom is evolved it becomes the center of energy in the great atomic principle, and when it is finally dissolved it resolves itself back into its original state, and its life as an individual atom ceases, although the experience it has gained becomes the property of the entire principle. It is as if a body of water were to be resolved into millions of tiny dewdrops for a time, and each dewdrop was then to acquire certain outside material and solution. In that case, each dewdrop when it again returned to the body of water, would carry with it its foreign material, which would become the property of the whole. And subsequently formed dewdrops would carry in their substance a particle of the foreign matter brought back home by the previous generation of dewdrops, and would thus be a little different from their predecessors. And this process, continuing for many generations of dewdrops, would ultimately cause the greatest changes in the composition of the successive generations. This, in short, is the story of the change and improving forms of life. From the atoms into the elements, from the lower elements into those forming protoplasm, from the protoplasm to the lower forms of animal life, from these lower forms onto higher forms. This is the story. But it is all a counterpart of the dewdrop and the body of water, until the human soul is evolved. The plants and the lower forms of animal life are not permanent individual souls, but each family is a group soul corresponding to the body of water from which the dewdrop arose. From these family group souls gradually break off minor groups, representing species, and so on into subspecies. At last when the forms reach the plane of man, the group soul breaks itself up into permanent individual souls, and true metempsychosis begins. That is, each individual human soul becomes a permanent individual entity, destined to evolve and perfect itself along the lines of spiritual evolution. And from this point begins our story of spiritual evolution. The story of man, the individual, begins amidst humble surroundings. Primitive man, but little above the level of the lower animals in point of intelligence, has nevertheless the distinguishing mark of individuality, self-consciousness, which is the demarcation between beast and man. And even the lowest of the lowest traces had at least a trace of this self-consciousness, which made of them individuals, and caused the fragment of the race soul to separate itself from the general principle animating the race, and to fasten its eye conscious upon itself, rather than upon the underlying race soul, along instinctive lines. Do you know just what this self-consciousness is, and how it differs from the physical consciousness of the lower animals? Perhaps we had better pause a moment to consider it at this place. The lower animals are of course conscious of the bodies, and their wants, feelings, emotions, desires, etc., and their actions are in response to the animating impulses coming from this plane of consciousness. But it stops there. They know, but they do not know that they know, that is, they have not yet arrived at a state in which they can think of themselves as I, and to reason upon their thoughts and mental operations. It is like the consciousness of a very young child, which feels and knows its sensations and wants, but is unable to think of itself as I, and to turn the mental gaze inward. In another book of these series we have used the illustration of the horse which has been left standing out in the cold sleet and rain, and which undoubtedly feels and knows the unpleasant sensations arising therefrom, and longs to get away from the unpleasant environment. But, still, he is unable to analyze his mental states and wonder whether his master will come out to him soon, or think how cruel it is to keep him out of his warm comfortable stable, or wonder whether he will be taken out in the cold rain again tomorrow, or feel envious of other horses who are indoors, or wonder why he is kept out cold nights, etc., etc. In short, the horse is unable to think as would a reasoning man under just the same circumstances. He is aware of the discomfort, just as would be the man, and he would run away home, if he were able, just as would the man. But he is not able to pity himself, nor to think about his personality, as would a man. He is not able to wonder whether life is worth the living, etc., as would a man. He knows but is not able to reflect upon the knowing. In the above illustration, the principal point is that the horse does not know himself as an entity, while even the most primitive man is able to so recognize himself as an I. If the horse were able to think in words, he would think feel, cold, hurt, etc., but he would be unable to think I feel, I am cold, I am hurt, etc. The thought I would be missing. It is true that the I consciousness of the primitive man was slight, and was but a degree above the physical consciousness of the higher apes, but nevertheless it had sprung into being, never again to be lost. The primitive man was like a child a few years old. He was able to say I, and to think I. He had become an individual soul, and this individual soul inhabited and animated a body but little removed from that of an ape. But this new consciousness began to mold that rude body, and the ascent was begun. Each generation showed a physical improvement over that of the preceding one, according to the lines of physical evolution. And as the developing soul demanded more perfect and developed bodies, the bodies were evolved to meet the demand, for the mental demand has ever been the cause of the physical form. The soul of the primitive man reincarnated almost immediately after the death of the physical body, because the experiences gained were mostly along the lines of the physical, the mental planes being scarcely brought into play, while the higher and spiritual faculties were almost entirely obscured from sight. Life after life the soul of the primitive man lived out in rapid succession, but in each new embodiment there was a slight advance over that of the previous one. Experience, or rather the result of experiences, were carried over, and profited by. New lessons were learned and unlearned, improved upon or discarded, and the race grew and unfolded. After a time the number of advancing souls which had outstripped their fellows in progress became sufficiently large for sub-races to be formed, and so the branching off process began. In this way the various races and types were formed, and the progress of mankind gained headway. At this point we may as well consider the history of the races of mankind, that we may see how the great tide wave of soul has ever pressed onward, marking higher and still higher stages of progress, and also how the various minor waves of the great wave pushed in and then receded, only to be followed by still higher waves. The story is most interesting. The yogi teachings inform us that the grand cycle of man's life on the earth is composed of 7 cycles, of which we are now living in the 3rd/7th part of the 5th cycle. These cycles may be spoken of as the great earth periods, separated from each other by some great natural cataclysm which destroyed the works of the previous races of men, and which started afresh the progress called civilization, which, as all students know, manifests a rise and fall like unto that of the tides. Man in the first cycle emerged from a gross animal-like state into a condition somewhat advanced. It was a slow progress, but nevertheless a distinct series of advances were made by the more progressive souls who passed over onto the 2nd cycle, embodying themselves as the ruling races in the same, their less progressive brothers incarnating in the lower tribes of the 2nd cycle. It must be remembered that the souls which do not advance during a cycle reincarnate in the next cycle among the lower races. So that even in this 5th cycle we have remnants of the previous cycles, the lives of the members of which give us an idea of what life in the earlier cycles must have been. The yogi teachings give us but little information regarding the people of the 1st and 2nd cycles, because of the low state of these ages. The tale, if told, would be the story of the cave dweller, and Stone Age people, the fire peoples, and all the rest of savage, barbarian crew. There was but little trace of anything like that which we call civilization, although in the latter periods of the 2nd cycle the foundations for the coming civilizations were firmly laid. After the cataclysm which destroyed the works of man of the 2nd cycle, and left the survivors scattered or disorganized, awaiting the touch of the organizing urge which followed shortly afterward, there dawned the first period of the third cycle. The scene of the life of the third cycle was laid in what is known to occultists as Lemuria. Lemuria was a mighty continent situated in what is now known as the Pacific Ocean, and parts of the Indian Ocean. It included Australia, Australasia, and other portions of the Pacific Islands, which are in fact surviving portions of the great continent of Lemuria. Its highest points, the lower portion having sunk beneath the seas ages and ages ago. Life in Lemuria is described as being principally concerned with the physical senses, and sensual enjoyment, only a few developed souls having broken through the fetters of materiality and reached the beginnings of the mental and spiritual planes of life. Some few indeed made great progress and were saved from the general wreck, in order to become the leaven which would lighten the mass of mankind during the next cycle. These developed souls were the teachers of the new races, and were looked upon by the latter as gods and supernatural beings, and legends and traditions concerning them are still existent among the ancient peoples of our present day. Many of the myths of the ancient peoples arose in this way. The yogi traditions hold that just prior to the great cataclysm which destroyed the races of the second cycle, there was a body of the chosen ones which migrated from Lemuria to certain islands of the sea which are now part of the mainland of India. These people formed the nucleus of the occult teachings of the Lemurians, and developed into the fount of truth which has been flowing ever since throughout the successive periods and cycles. When Lemuria passed away, there rose from the depths of the ocean the continent which was to be the scene of the life and civilization of the fourth cycle, the continent of Atlantis. Atlantis was situated in a portion of what is now known as the Atlantic Ocean, beginning at what is now known as the Caribbean Sea and extending over to the region of what is now known as Africa. What are now known as Cuba and the West Indies were among the highest points of the continent, and now stand like monuments to its departed greatness. The civilization of Atlantis was remarkable, and its people attained heights which seem almost incredible to even those who are familiar with the highest achievements of man in our own times. The chosen ones preserved from the cataclysm which destroyed Lemuria, and who lived to a remarkably old age, had stored up within their minds the wisdom and learning of the races that had been destroyed, and they thus gave the Atlanteans an enormous starting advantage. They soon attained great advancement along all the lines of human endeavor. They perfected mechanical inventions and appliances, reaching far ahead of even our present attainments. In the field of electricity especially, they reached the stages that our present races will reach in about 200 or 300 years from now. Along the lines of occult attainment, their progress was far beyond the dreams of the average man of our own race. And in fact from this arose one of the causes of their downfall, for they prostituted the power to base and selfish uses, and black magic. And, so the decline of Atlantis began. But the end did not come at once, or suddenly, but gradually. The continent, and its surrounding islands gradually sank beneath the waves of the Atlantic Ocean, the process occupying over 10,000 years. The Greeks and Romans of our own cycle had traditions regarding the sinking of the continent, but their knowledge referred only to the disappearance of the small remainder certain islands, the continent itself having disappeared thousands of years before their time. It is recorded that the Egyptian priests had traditions that the continent itself had disappeared 9,000 years before their time. As was the case with the chosen ones of Lemuria, so was it with the elect of Atlantis, who were taken away from the doomed land some time prior to its destruction. The few advanced people left their homes and migrated to portions of what are now South America and Central America, but which were then islands of the sea. These people have left their traces of their civilization and works, which our antiquaries are discovering today. When the fifth cycle dawned, our own cycle, remember, these brave and advanced souls acted as the race teachers and became as gods to those who came afterward. The races were very prolific, and multiplied very rapidly under the most favorable conditions. The souls of the Atlanteans were pressing forward for embodiment, and human forms were born to supply the demand. And now begins the history of our own cycle, the fifth cycle. But before we begin a consideration of the fifth cycle, let us consider for a moment a few points about the laws operating to cause these great changes. In the first place, each cycle has a different theater for its work and action. The continent of Lemuria was not in existence during the second cycle, and arose from the ocean bed only when its appointed time came. And, likewise, the continent of Atlantis reposed beneath the waves while the Lemurian races manifested during the third cycle, rising by means of a convulsion of the Earth's surface to play its part during its own period, the fourth cycle, only to sink again beneath the waves to make way for the birth of the fifth cycle with its races. By means of these cataclysms, the races of each cycle were wiped out when the time came. The few elect or chosen ones, that is those who have manifested the right to live on, being carried away to some favorable environment where they became as leaven to the mass as gods to the new races that quickly appear. It must be remembered, however, that these chosen ones are not the only ones saved from the destruction that overtakes the majority of the race. On the contrary, a few survivors are preserved, although driven away from their former homes, and reduced to first principles of living in order to become the parents of the new races. The new races springing from the fittest of these survivors quickly form subraces, being composed of the better adapted souls seeking reincarnation, while the less fit sink into barbarism, and show evidences of decay, although a remnant drags on for thousands of years, being composed of the souls of those who have not advanced sufficiently to take a part 1. The life of the new races. These leftovers are in evidence in our own times in the cases of the Australian savages, and some of the African tribes, as well as among the Digger Indians and others of similar grade of intelligence. In order to understand the advance of each race, it must be remembered that the more advanced souls, after passing out of the body, have a much longer period of rest in the higher planes, and consequently do not present themselves for reincarnation until a period quite late when compared with the hasty reincarnation of the less advanced souls who are hurried back to rebirth by reason of the strong earthly attachments and desires. In this way it happens that the earlier races of each cycle are more primitive folk than those who follow them as the years roll by. The soul of an earthbound person reincarnates in a few years, and sometimes in a few days, while the soul of an advanced man may repose and rest on the higher planes for centuries, nay, even for thousands of years, until the earth has reached a stage in which the appropriate environment may be afforded it. Observers, unconnected with occultism, have noted certain laws which seem to regulate the rise and fall of nations, the procession of ruling races. They do not understand the law of metempsychosis that alone gives the key to the problem, but nevertheless they have not failed to record the existence of the laws themselves. In order to show that these laws are recognized by persons who are not at all influenced by the occult teachings, we take the liberty of quoting from Draper's History of the Intellectual Development of Europe. Dr. Draper writes as follows: "We are, as we often say, the creatures of circumstances." In that expression there is a higher philosophy than might at first appear. From this more accurate point of view we should therefore consider the course of these events, recognizing the principle that the affairs of men pass forward in a determinate way, expanding and unfolding themselves. And hence we see that the things of which we have spoken as if they were matters of choice, were in reality forced upon their apparent authors by the necessity of the times. But in truth they should be considered as the presentation of a certain phase of life which nations in their onward course sooner or later assume. To the individual, how well we know that a sober moderation of action, an appropriate gravity of demeanor, belonging to the mature period of life, change from the wanton willfulness of youth, which may be ushered in, or its beginnings marked by many accidental incidents, in one perhaps by domestic bereavements, in another by the loss of fortune, in a third by ill health. We are correct enough in imputing to such trials the change of character, but we never deceive ourselves by supposing that it would have failed to take place had these incidents not occurred. There runs an irresistible destiny in the midst of these vicissitudes. There are analogies between the life of a nation, and that of an individual, who, though he may be in one respect the maker of his own fortunes, for happiness or for misery, for good or for evil, though he remains here or goes there as his inclinations prompt, though he does this or abstains from that as he chooses, is nevertheless held fast by an inexorable fate, a fate which brought him into the world involuntarily, so far as he was concerned, which presses him forward through a definite career, the stages of which are absolutely invariable: infancy, childhood, youth, maturity, old age, with all their characteristic actions and passions, and which removes him from the scene at the appointed time, in most cases against his will. So also is it with nations. The voluntary is only the outward semblance, governing but hardly hiding the predetermined. Over the events of life we may have control, but none whatever over the law of its progress. There is a geometry that applies to nations, an equation of their curve of advance, that no mortal man can touch. This remarkable passage, just quoted, shows how the close observers of history note the rise and fall of the tides of human race progress, although ignorant of the real underlying causing energy or force. A study of the occult teachings alone gives one the hidden secret of human actions and throws the bright light of truth upon the dark corners of phenomena. At the beginning of the fifth cycle, which is the present one, there were not only the beginnings of the new races which always spring up at the beginning of each new cycle and which are the foundations for the coming races which take advantage of the fresh conditions and opportunities for growth and development, but there were also the descendants of the elect saved from the destruction of Atlantis by having been led away and colonized far from the scene of danger. The new races were the descendant of the scattered survivors of the Atlantean peoples, that is, the common run of people of the time. But the elect few were a very superior people, and imparted to their descendants their knowledge and wisdom. So that we see at the beginning of the fifth cycle hordes of new, primitive people in certain lands, and in other places advanced nations like the ancestors of the ancient Egyptians, Persians, Chaldeans, Hindus, etc. These advanced races were old souls, advanced souls, the progressed and developed souls of ancient Lemuria and Atlantis, who lived their lives and who are now either on higher planes of life, or else are among us today taking a leading part. 1. The world's affairs, striving mightily to save the present races from the misfortunes which overtook their predecessors. The descendants of the people were the Assyrians and Babylonians. In due time the primitive new races developed and the great Roman, Grecian, and Carthaginian peoples appeared. Then came the rise of other peoples and nations down to the present time. Each race or nation has its rise, its height of attainment, and its decline. When a nation begins to decline, it is because its more advanced souls have passed on, and only the less progressive souls are left. The history of all nations show the truth of the occult. The term men are forsaking old ideals, creeds and dogmas, and are running hither and thither seeking something they feel to be necessary, but of the nature of which they know nothing. They are feeling the hunger for peace, the thirst for knowledge, and they are seeking satisfaction in all directions. This is not only the inevitable working of the law of evolution, but is also a manifestation of the power and love of the great souls that have passed on to higher planes of existence, and who have become as angels and archangels. These beings are filled with the love of the race, and are setting into motion influences that are being manifest in many directions, the tendency of which are to bring the race to a realization of its higher power, faculties, and destiny. As we have said in other places, one of the greatest difficulties in the way of the seeker after truth in his consideration of the question of spiritual evolution is the feeling that rebirth is being forced upon him, without any say on his part, and against his desires. But this is far from being correct. It is true that the whole process is according to the great law, but that law operates through the force of desire and attraction. The soul is attracted toward rebirth by reason of its desire, or rather the essence of its desires. It is reborn only because it has within itself the desire for further experience, and opportunity for unfoldment. And it is reborn into certain environments solely because it has within itself unsatisfied desires for those environments, etc. The process is just as regular and scientific as is the attraction of one atom of matter for another. Each soul has within itself certain elements of desire and attraction, and it attracts to itself certain conditions and experiences, and is in turn attracted by these things. This is the law of life, in the body and out of it. And there is no injustice in the law. It is the essence of justice itself, for it gives to each just what is required to fill the indwelling desires, or else the conditions and experiences designed to burn out the desires which are holding one back, and the destruction of which will make possible future advancement. For instance, if one is bound by the inordinate desire for material wealth, the law of karma will attract him to a rebirth in conditions in which he will be surrounded by wealth and luxury until he becomes sickened with them and will find his heart filled with the desire to flee from them and toward higher and more satisfying things. Of course, the law of karma acts in other ways. As we shall see in our next lesson, it deals with one's debts and obligations. Also, the law of karma is closely connected with metempsychosis, and one must be considered in connection with the other. Always. Not only is it true that man's rebirths are in strict accordance with the law of attraction and desire, But it is also true that after he attains a certain stage of spiritual unfoldment he enters into the conscious stage of rebirth, and thereafter he is reborn consciously and with full foreknowledge. Many are now entering into this stage of development, and have a partial consciousness of their past lives, which also implies that they have had at least a partial consciousness of approaching rebirth, for the two phases of consciousness run together. Those individuals of a race who have outstripped their fellows in spiritual unfoldment, are still bound by the karma of the particular race to which they belong, up to a certain point. And as the entire race, or at least a large proportion of it, must move forward as a whole, such individuals must needs wait also. But they are not compelled to suffer a tiresome round of continued rebirths amid environments and conditions which they have outgrown. On the contrary, the advanced individual soul is allowed to wait until the race reaches its own stage of advancement, when it again joins in the upward movement, in full consciousness. However, in the interim he may pass his well-earned rest either on some of the higher planes of rest, or else in conscious temporary sojourn in other material spheres, helping in the great work as a teacher and worker for good and spiritual evolution among those who need such help. In fact, there are in the world today, individual souls which have reached similar stages on other planets, and who are spending their rest period here amidst the comparatively lower Earth conditions, striving to lift up the Earth souls to greater heights. So long as people allow themselves to become attached to material objects, so long will they be reborn in conditions in which these objects bind them fast. It is only when the soul frees itself from these entangling obstructions that it is born in conditions of freedom. Some outgrow these material attachments by right thinking and reasoning, while others seem to be compelled to live them out, and thus outlive them, before they are free. At last, when the soul realizes that these things are merely incidents of the lower personality, and have naught to do with the real individuality, then, and then only, do they fall from it like a walnut cloak, and are left behind while it bounds forward on the path fresh from the lighter weight being carried. The yogi philosophy teaches that man will live forever, ascending from higher to higher planes, and then on and on and on. Death is but the physical symbol of a period of soul rest, similar to sleep of the tired body, and is just as much to be welcomed and greeted with thanks. Life is continuous, and its object is development, unfoldment and growth. We are in eternity now as much as we ever shall be. Our souls may exist out of the body as well as in it, although bodily incarnation is necessary at this stage of our development. As we progress onto higher planes of life, we shall incarnate in bodies far more ethereal than those now used by us. Just as in the past we used bodies almost incredibly grosser and coarser than those we call our own today, life is far more than a thing of 70 years. It is really a succession of such lives, on an ascending scale, that which we call our personal self today being merely the essence of the experiences of countless lives in the past. The soul is working steadily upward, from higher to higher, from gross to finer forms and manifestations, and it will steadily work for ages to come, always progressing, always advancing, always unfolding. The universe contains many worlds for the soul to inhabit, and then after it has passed on to other universes, there will still be infinitude before it. The destiny of the soul of man is of wondrous promise and possibilities. The mind today cannot begin to even dream of what is before the soul. Those who have already advanced many steps beyond you, those elder brethren, are constantly extending to you aid in many directions. They are extending to you the unseen hand, which lifts you over many a hard place and dangerous crossing, but you recognize it not except in a vague way. There are now in existence, on planes infinitely higher than your own, intelligences of transcendent glory and magnificence, but they were once men even as you are today. They have so far progressed upon the path that they have become as angels and archangels when compared with you. And, blessed thought, even as these exalted ones were once even as you, so shall you, in due course of spiritual evolution, become even as these mighty ones. The yogi philosophy teaches that you who are reading these lines have lived many lives previous to the present one. You have lived in the lower forms, and have worked your way arduously along the path until now you are reaching the stage of spiritual consciousness in which the past and future will begin to appear plain to you for the first time. You have lived as the caveman, the cliff dweller, the savage, the barbarian. You have been the warrior, the priest, the medieval scholar and occultist, the prince, the pauper. You have lived in Lemuria, in Atlantis, in India, in Persia, in Egypt, in ancient Rome and Greece, and are now playing your part 1. The Western civilization, associating with many with whom you have had relations in your past lives. In closing this lesson, let us quote from a previous writing from the same pen that writes this lesson. Toward what goal is all this spiritual evolution tending? What does it all mean? From the low planes of life to the highest, all are on the path. To what state or place does the path lead? Let us attempt to answer by asking you to imagine a series of millions of circles, one within the other. Each circle means a stage of life. The outer circles are filled with life in its lowest and most material stages. Each circle nearer the center holds higher and higher forms until men, or what were once men, become as gods. Still on, and on, and on, does the form of life grow higher, until the human mind cannot grasp the idea. But what is the center? The mind of the entire spiritual body, the Absolute. And we are traveling toward that center. And again from the same source, but beyond your plane, and beyond mine, our plane after plane, connected with our Earth, the splendors of which men cannot conceive. And there are likewise many planes around the other planets of our chain, and there are millions of other worlds, and there are chains of universes, just as there are chains of planets, and then greater groups of these chains, and so on, greater and grander beyond the power of man to imagine, on and on and on and on, higher and higher to inconceivable heights. An infinity of infinities of worlds are before us. Our world and our planetary system and our system of suns, and our system of solar systems, are but as grains of sand on the beach of the mighty ocean. But then you cry, but what am I, poor mortal thing, lost among all this inconceivable greatness? The answer comes that you are that most precious thing, a living soul. And if you were destroyed, the whole system of universes would crumble, for you are as necessary as the greatest part of it. It cannot do without you. You cannot be lost or destroyed. You are a part of it all, and are eternal. But, you ask, beyond all of this of which you have told me, what is there? What is the center of it all? Your teacher's face takes on a rapt expression. A light knot of earth beams forth from his countenance. The Absolute. He replies,